Good evening to everybody here in this room at Monash University in Melbourne, and greetings also to those of you who are watching on YouTube all over Australia and indeed around the world. My name is Viv Ellis and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Education, and I'm the host for this evening's lecture. I'll begin by acknowledging that we're meeting here on the unceded lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation here at Monash Caulfield, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us in the room this evening or who may be watching via YouTube. And then I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which you YouTube viewers may be located this evening. You join us then today for the first lecture in the new biennial Peter Fensham lecture series that we plan to become the signature public lecture of the Faculty of Education. And I will say a little bit more about our inaugural lecturer in a moment, but first I would like to introduce the series by focusing initially on Peter Fensham himself. Before I came to Australia to take up this position as Dean, you may recognise I'm not from these parts, I also knew of Professor Peter Fensham's international reputation and legacy as an exceptional academic leader, researcher and educator. Indeed, on his passing in 2021, I was emailed by education researchers from all over the world, emphasising that we'd lost not only an exceptional academic, but also an exceptional human being. Peter Fensham was appointed Professor of Science Education at Monash in 1967, the first such professorship anywhere in the world outside the USA. He came to that position with 2 PhDs, one in physical chemistry and a second in social psychology. He also came with deep concerns for social responsibility in and by scientists and core moral commitments to equity, social justice, humanity and compassion across all human endeavours. And he lived those core values in every way. And those are the values and the moral commitments that lecturers in the Peter Fensham series will embody starting this evening. Before retirement in 1992, Peter was Dean of the Faculty for 8 years, and he developed strong teaching and research collaborations across Monash and contributed immensely to broader Monash policies. His leadership rapidly created a science education research group with a very high international standing. Indeed, even prior to the advent of the internet and social media, and the desire of universities to get their academics to use social media to leverage global impact, Peter Fensham had a very high international reputation in science education, in part for his iconic phrase to describe the science curriculum he wrote about and that he advocated for, which was science for all. Peter Fensham's wider contributions in education, though, are worth dwelling on for a moment, and they were highly diverse and international in their reach. And here are just 2 notable examples. In 1970, his edited book, Rights and Inequality in Australian Education, became the basis for the quite radical needs-based school funding introduced by the reformist Whitlam government in 1972. And he played then a leading role in the 70s and the early 80s in both establishing environmental education in Australia, in its earliest development around the globe also, and he was the formal representative of the Federal Minister for Environment at the first 2 intergovernmental international conferences on environmental education in 1975 and 1977. In 2008, as part of its 50th birthday celebrations, Monash made a special award to just 15 academics to acknowledge the exceptional contribution they have made to their field of research and the community over the 50 years of Monash University's existence. Peter Fensham was just one of 3 recipients from a non-laboratory science Monash faculty, and the only one from education. He was, as this briefest of overviews suggests, a remarkable person. But at this point in the proceedings, I'd now like to invite Rachel Fensham and Patrick Fensham, 2 of Peter's children, to come to the stage to say a little bit more about the father they knew as well as the person that I've been speaking about. Rachel and Patrick.
Thank you, Viv. And I can only say on behalf of all of the Fenshams that are here today and the extended Fensham family, we're really thrilled to be here and to have Dad honoured in this way. I had the great misfortune of coming to Monash in 1995, which I think was maybe about 7 years after Dad had retired. And he was by then living in Queensland. And a lot of people would, of course, still remember my father. Oh, you're Peter Fensham's daughter. Many, many times said over. And I would say, yes, I am. Fortunately, I work in a field that's entirely not his discipline. But one of the curious things about that was that I always felt that I came to his university, right? Because Monash was quite truly our universe as kids growing up, because there wasn't really a separation between Dad, the professor, Dad, the academic, Dad, the researcher, Dad, the international traveller, and all of the engagements he had with Monash, the universe, because it also came home and was often part of our family life. And I'll just hand over to Patrick.
Yeah, so Dad delighted in making and nurturing international connections through his work in education, and as a family we hosted and met students from Myanmar, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, plus any number of visiting academics, particularly from the US and UK, but also across Europe. And a particular party trick of Dad's was taking a bemused visitor to a then VFL game as a uniquely Melbourne cultural experience, and an unexpected afternoon spent at wet and windy old VFL Park at Waverley would be likely a lifetime memory for some of these visitors. His travels opened up a world of friendships and relationships, including for us children. More than once I stayed with academic colleagues of Dad's in other parts of the world, in different parts of the world, including, I recall, in Tübingen in Germany when solo travelling, and I must admit I've forgotten even the person who I stayed with, but they were a welcome host, and Gothenburg in Sweden at that time with Dad. And I recall just this afternoon that my brother Rod developed a fly fishing interest shared with Selby Smith, who was actually the Dean of Education at Monash when Dad was appointed, and I think Rod travelled with Selby in Tasmania, so a deep connection forged with a senior academic colleague in that regard. So these opportunities arose because of the connections he forged and encouraged to expand and multiply, and this was very much in keeping with his philosophy, indeed his personal spirituality of building and nurturing connections as foundational to a meaningful life. So this lecture series, named in his honour, is a further way of keeping this spirit of connection through knowledge exchange and discussion and learning alive, and I certainly look forward to hearing what Peter has to say a bit later.
And I'll just one little comment that came to mind when Viv mentioned environmental education. I think Dad always used to try and kind of keep us engaged, and probably in my recalcitrant teenage years, he was developing the environmental education curriculum, and I remember he asked me to help him with the design of all the artwork for the cover of that curriculum, so I hope it went down well. But that was a way of drawing me in. We're going to hear a little bit shortly from Viv about this legacy foundation fund that's being established. But I wanted to also just share a couple of insights about our mother, Christine Fensham's contribution to education, because we feel strongly that she was very much a big part of our father's life and the capacity that he had as an academic leader. As I said, it came into the home, and their convictions and commitments were very much shared. Mum had started off with many other things, but she became a high school teacher, and she got inspired by working in adult education at perhaps the first neighbourhood house in North Nunawading. She then identified an opportunity to open another neighbourhood house in Blackburn in a property that was owned by the Avenue Church, where Mum and Dad went to church, the Uniting Church. And it was here she, I think, also found her calling as an educational leader. Like many of those neighbourhood houses, it offered a wide range of classes, and it was open to women who had been at home with children or out of the workforce for some time. And it provided a way for them back into study or to work. One of the things that I recall her working on was the documentation to have some of the courses that they offered accredited by TAFE so that women could make the transition from, the neighbourhood house setting into more formal education. This particularly was not without controversy on both sides, from government providers that wanted to resist giving accreditation to something like a neighbourhood house, and those that on the community side wanted to resist the formalisation that would require. But it was nonetheless, I think, a really remarkable achievement that this provided pathways for women once it was approved. And the other thing, I suppose, just to say about Mum is still alive, and although she has very advanced dementia, and she's 96, I've certainly been telling her about the lecture series and about the fund that we've established. And so on Sunday, I thought I'd give it a go, see how much I could get from Christine about what her understanding of what it is that we're doing. And I said to her, "What do you believe in terms of education?" She said, "Everyone has to be involved." I said, "Why?" "Education means a lot. Everyone needs to learn things and to know different tasks." And then I said, bit prompting, "You've worked a lot with women. Why is it important for them?" "To work, to be independent." "Yes, very important." So with that, I hope you understand that both Mum and Dad thought education lifelong was really important. And as I say, we're really delighted at the support that we've had from Dick Gunston, who really initiated the lecture series, and with Viv's support, this series will be launched tonight, as you know, and also the support that we've had from him and Lisa Mitchell in terms of establishing the fund. So, I think on behalf of all the family, I'd like to say a very big thank you to all of those people as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Patrick. I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Christine, but I have heard about her significant contributions, both in supporting Peter's career, but also in empowering women in her own role in education through community learning centres and in Australia and in Southeast Asia. And as Rachel has just indicated tonight, alongside the Fensham family, and in addition to Rachel and Patrick, I think we have their siblings Mark and Rod here, as well as other members of the family and grandchildren. And so this evening we are honouring Peter and Christine Fensham's unwavering commitment as advocates for lifelong learning, discovery, access to education and social justice. So tonight we're privileged to build on that legacy to officially launch the Peter and Christine Fensham Regional Research Fund, FRRF, reflecting our shared ambition to transform education through global research impact. Peter and Christine understood the importance of collaboration in solving great challenges, and the family have endowed the FRRF, and supported by us in the faculty, to provide opportunities for international scholars to collaborate through a network that we already have called the Regional Research Catalyst Network. And what that does is it aligns with Impact 2030, which is Monash University's strategy, and we're particularly focused through this fund on inclusive education and leveraging the achievements of people internationally as well as in Australia. And I think that also aligns with Peter and Christine's vision. So through scholarships, research workshops, the FRRF will support culturally responsible and sustaining research that is led by early and mid-career researchers at Monash University's campuses in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Melbourne. And these efforts will lead to impactful collaborations, publications, webinars, research proposals, and so on, led by our regional research catalyst, Dr. S.K. Sato, in the Faculty of Education. Now, as we know, sustainable and meaningful change does not happen in isolation. And so to support these generations of future scholars to access these opportunities, we warmly invite you to consider your own philanthropic contribution to the Peter and Christine Fensham Regional Research Fund. And this is something that we as a faculty want to grow over the years ahead. So please take a flyer with you. I think some are in the room, and Alyssa Porritt is at the back of the room if you're here in Melbourne, who can give you a flyer about that. That is something that you can do to help us create change for future generations. So thank you on behalf of the Faculty of Education and Monash University to the Fensham family for making this happen. Thank you. So now it is my honour and pleasure to introduce our inaugural Peter Fensham lecturer. Laureate Professor Peter Doherty is the patron of the Peter Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, widely known as the Doherty Institute during and since the COVID-19 pandemic. This institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and Melbourne Health. For many years, he conducted research at St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was a faculty member at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center through the College of Medicine. He is a multiple award winner and highly distinguished researcher, receiving the Albert Lasker Award for Basic Medical Research in 1995, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine, jointly with Rolf M. Zinkernagel in 1996, and he was named Australian of the Year in 1997. He is also recognised as a National Trust Australian Living Treasure. He is a great science communicator and an advocate for the promotion of scientific literacy or the public understanding of science. In tonight's lecture, we will hear about the challenges of public science communication in contemporary societies, emphasising the crucial role of experts in advocating for evidence-based perspectives on global issues such as public health and climate change. Professor Doherty will highlight the challenges posed by the evolving media landscape and address the complexities of misinformation and conspiracy theories. So please join me in welcoming the inaugural Peter Fensham lecturer, Laureate Professor Peter Doherty.
Thank you for the nice introduction. I fear you may get more clarity from the introduction than you get from me. I have absolutely no training in science education or in public science information exchange. I have no formal training in any of that. I'm not even a university teacher. I'm a basic scientist, a discovery scientist, and mostly I'm known for the work I've done with laboratory mice as an MD, a mouse doctor. My actual initial training was in veterinary science. I'm the only Nobel Prize winner who's trained in that particular area. I think I'm the only Nobel Prize winner who's been bitten by a pig or he's had his arm up the backside of at least 3,000 cows, but perhaps enough of that. I worked for 20 years in the United States, and I have great affection for that country, but I am watching with a mixture of fascination and complete horror what is going on there in the political scene. And I think a lot of what's going on there in the political scene reflects this need for public science education, information. And I'm not sure actually that I'm actually talking about science. I think I'm talking about critical thinking skills as much as I'm talking about science. How do we disseminate in the broader population critical thinking skills, the idea that evidence is important, the idea that the reality is the reality of nature. Economists, of course, can't believe there's any other reality than economics. They don't use data much, these guys. I mean, here I'm being Trumpian, and they make it up as they go along. But I would suggest that the reality of climate change in the end will trump sorry, the reality of economics. I should explain to you, I have Trump derangement syndrome. As a veterinarian, I'm very aware that there are certain tapeworms that release larvae into our blood that migrate through our brain. And that's how I think of Trump, as a larva migrating through my brain. I just hope he doesn't stay there as a kind of cyst. That can't happen. Then you need neurosurgery. So, to go into my lecture, I promised to stop at 5:45. 19:45, sorry. So, I do think that the political situation at the moment through the world is increasingly disturbing. We're seeing countries like Turkey and Hungary that had democratic governments turn towards dictatorships. We're seeing the rise of people like Putin. There could have been a different outcome in Russia, and it's not just totally down to the Russians what happened there, I think, but there hasn't been. And of course, we see America on the cusp of voting for someone who has publicly stated, vote for me and there'll be no more elections. It is a very disturbing time, and I think until November 5th, it's right up there in front of us. It's intriguing. This is Monash University, of course, and there's that story out there, and I'm sure it's true, that Sir John Monash was approached, I think in the 1920s, by ex-servicemen with the idea that he should assume the role of a dictator and that Australia would work better with Monash running the country. Monash killed that very fast. His statement, that was reported in that impeccable academic journal, The Age, Good Weekend, very recently, the future of Australia relies on the ballot box and on an educated electorate. If we take Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, one of the great statements of history, his final line in that address, given on the battlefield of Gettysburg long after it was over, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. I very much worry that the challenge for us is to ensure that government by the oligarchs or the robber barons and globalised corporation for the oligarchs and globalised corporations does not rule the earth. One of my great heroes is American President Teddy Roosevelt, who took on the robber barons. He was a Republican. He took them on, he put them in their place, and then, of course, Franklin Delano, his successor, is one of the reasons that the Republicans are still so upset with the Democrats, because he did great things and did it through often public funding and public spending. The primary requirement for an educated electorate in this 21st century is, in my opinion, that citizens must have some level of basic literacy. That requires, of course, great teachers and great fit-for-person science education. I don't think there's one size for all with science education. We're going to have some people that are going on to be professional scientists or medical doctors at university and all the rest of it. We have many that aren't. But I think we need to get an understanding of those basic values of science that are embedded widely in the community. It's not really the details that we need out there in the wider community. It's the idea that probability and relative risk govern many things, and that a dedication to evidence-based reality has to be front and centre in our thinking. And with the challenges facing us, I don't see how we're going to get through that unless we have that type of thinking permeating our broader community. And it's very encouraging, I think, to see how young people are taking on the cause of doing something about climate change. That says to me, not only are they very aware, that says to me that certain aspects of formal science education in this country have been working reasonably well. So for my generation, of course, that's totally different. And I mean, people of my father's generation would talk about the human body as the system. I have no idea what they thought the system was, but we have to move on beyond that. And also, when it comes to the natural world that sustains us, I think younger people have this sense of ownership and responsibility that, again, needs to permeate our thinking as a society. I think that the more that citizens can view challenges through the prism of healthy, informed scepticism, the better our civil society will be. Some basic questions we should all ask. What is the problem, and is it correctly identified? How good is the evidence? What are the underlying causes? Can we correct the issue and/or adapt to it? We could, of course, also probe the experience and level of motivation of protagonists who may be against these ideas or for it. But I think it's very important that we don't fall into the trap of blame games. We saw so much of that through COVID, blame games. It can't be a bad virus, it has to be bad guys. I mean, it's standard procedure, because then it takes you away from looking at the problem itself and making it, identifying it with conspiracies and all the rest of it. And the whole debate around virus origins, it really is redolent of that bad guy thing. We have to identify the bad guys, we have to punish them. That's not what we have to do. What we have to do is look at the problem, do what we can to protect the problem, and at least acknowledge there is a problem. As everyone in this room understands, we have been living, especially if you're my age, I was born in 1940, we have been living through a time of extraordinary and unpredicted social and economic transformation that's largely been driven by the enthusiastic and, in fact, inevitable adoption of disruptive technology. Many people who are very dissatisfied, say in the American Midwest currently, don't connect with the idea that much of what they blame on the politicians isn't actually down to politics. The fact that Main Street has disappeared from country towns as a function of modern communications technology and the fact that people have switched to online marketing and buying purchases online. The fact that the local newspaper has disappeared is not due to the politicians, it's due to the fact of communications technology and the situation we find ourselves in, where we're in a sort of a transition between the conventional media. I grew up in an Australia where we didn't even have television until 1957, I think it was, and the online resource and social media, YouTube, and all those other things that are now the communications source for particularly many of us who are younger. Listening to the account of Peter Fensham, I've thought for many years that many of the most interesting people I read about in the age were in the obituaries, and I really wish that I'd known them. Now we don't even get the obituaries. I mean, so I'm missing even that experience. But we miss many great people. We don't tell the right stories often. In some ways, the world of my childhood, to me, now seems as remote as the time of Shakespeare and the 18th century French Revolution. And some of what's happening is life-enhancing, the revolution in information, access and exchange, but it's yet to find solid ground. I think there's an article in this morning's Conversation. Do you read the Conversation? Oh, thank you. That's good. I helped start it, so I'm very proud of the Conversation, even though I had a very minor role. Mishy Ketchell, who's the current editor, said that there's a statement around in the sort of communication community that the internet is increasingly becoming the shitnet. And I'm afraid that's kind of true. And how we sort this out and how we get some sort of quality in that, I really well, it's not for me to work out. Maybe some of you young guys can work that one through. We face enormous challenges. We face an enormous challenge from human population growth. We face an enormous challenge from climate change and degradation and pollution of terrestrial and ocean environments. Anthropogenic global warming threatens the continued health of many marine ecosystems as well as land ecosystems. We worry about our Great Barrier Reef. Evidently, it's not in too bad shape at the moment, but it's had successive episodes of bleaching, and as waters warm, this will become inexorable. Glacier melt. In Switzerland, their summer water comes from glacier meltwater. They've had since the 16th century separate councils that are concerned with disseminating that water and sharing it out. We could do something like that for the Mississippi River, maybe. No, the Murray-Darling, sorry, wrong river. Memphis is on the Mississippi. I tell you, the American rivers, you may not know this, this is what Trump says. You may not know this, and then he invents something. This is not an invention. All US rivers that flow into the sea are under the administration and control of the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Okay? Simple solution. You give it to a bunch of engineers. Engineers get stuff done. They're great people. And you make them army as well. They get stuff done, even if it's sometimes killing people, but at least this is a non-damaging thing. Sometimes they get things wrong. They put up flood mitigation strategies, physical barriers that haven't worked out. They've torn them down again. They learn by their mistakes. We lived in Memphis, Tennessee. It's hundreds of miles from the ocean. There's a Coast Guard cutter in Memphis. And so I think we need something like that in Australia to actually pull that together. But if you look at Switzerland, they're now losing their glaciers at an incredible rate. And this is going to affect the flow of water into the lake that Geneva's on, and it's also, and that lake, again, feeds the Rhone River. So it's going to affect the flow of that river. We're seeing in Bolivia, the lack of glacier meltwater is removing a lot of their water supply. So these are tremendous threats. We don't think a lot about glacier melt in Australia for obvious reasons. But these effects are already, I think, having a profound effect on political life, especially in the poorer countries. Always, it's the poorest that are the most vulnerable. But it's also the case that, as Dickens said back when he wrote A Tale of Two Cities, which is, of course, about the period immediately after the French Revolution. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness, it was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity, and what's so different now? Some great things have happened over the last 50 or 60 years or so. Australia's overall life expectancy in 1950 was 66.5 years. It's now 83.2 years in 2020. There are many factors at work here. Getting smoking out of the equation has had a big effect. Many public health strategies, public education strategies, and so forth. Better diets. The mortality rate for heart disease has fallen dramatically. That's particularly due to getting smoking out of the system, but it's also due to statins. It's also due to blood pressure meds, and it's also due to surgery. So there's a whole mix of medical technologies that have come into play here to improve that situation. That's what's happening at the moment in a very exciting way, I think, with cancer. It's gradual, it's incremental, it goes from one cancer to the next, but we're going to see big developments over the next 20 years or so in treating many, many cancers. We've already seen some major breakthroughs, both coming from the molecular pharmacological side, drugs, and from now the immunology side. The biggest, most expensive drugs at the moment that are selling very well for drug companies are actually immunological reagents like monoclonal antibodies. If you hear about a drug that's got MAB at the end, that's what it is. And of course, that in turn, though, is putting enormous pressure on our healthcare systems, even though our governments have been reasonably good at negotiating reasonably decent prices for these things. That is having a big effect on the funding of our healthcare systems. And we can't spend all our money on healthcare. So we have to work out some better way of doing this. So in a way, it's hardly surprising that most of us do embrace advances in medicine that lead to improved health and well-being. There are, of course, controversial areas, the people who believe greatly that everything has to be natural, and I won't go into that. There's some useful thinking there and some that's not so useful. There's the anti-vaccine sentiments. Certainly the mRNA vaccines that were used with COVID didn't help some of that. They don't provide protection. They only provide an amelioration of the disease process at best. And they certainly worked well early on when the virus wasn't changing so fast. They don't work as well now. I'll still get them and get multiple jabs. I've never had a bad experience with the vaccine, but others did. There's a lot of research to be done here. There's a lot of improvement to be done. One of the most interesting observations I've seen recently, it looks like a nice piece of science, is that spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is a very central to pathology, actually binds fibrin. And that would explain why COVID-19, I'm not going to talk much about COVID-19 because it's a disease we very imperfectly understand even now. That's why COVID-19 is not just a respiratory infection, it's actually what we call a coagulopathy. It's a blood clotting disease. And in fact, that's probably what a lot of the severe manifestations are down to. It may actually be what's behind long COVID. But that has to be worked through. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I tried to sort of talk generally about science and how it's done and what it means and how to look at a scientific paper, because scientific papers are now open access. Anyone can read many of them, and how to interpret the way that science works. And I tried to discuss that from the point of view of an insider in biomedical science and an outsider in climate science, because I've been very interested in climate science for some years now. That was in a book called The Knowledge Wars that I published in 2015. But of course, the problem with publishing books is the people who buy them are already the converted, and it's a great way of getting your own thinking straight to write a book. But whether it's a particularly good means of communication, I'm not so sure. And certainly it's not a good means of communication for getting out to that much broader audience. In the 1789 revolution in France, the reign of terror and all that, when Marie Antoinette lost her head, and when they showed that at the ramp up to the Olympics in Paris, it caused a lot of confusion in Trump supporters for some reason. But that had been sort of coming on for some considerable time. I'd always thought it was Louis XV that said it, but it was actually Madame de Pompadour, who's his chief mistress. I mean, again, we're thinking of Donald Trump, who said, après nous le déluge. And of course, that's what happened at the time of the actual revolution itself. But the revolution was triggered by the fact that people were hungry. There just wasn't enough to eat. They'd had successive crop failures, and the revolution happened because of that. Did Marie Antoinette say, let them eat cake? Probably not very wise. But it went, I don't know, but it went viral in the social media of the day. And the social media of the day, of course, is gossip over the back fence. And that's what a lot of social media is, gossip. And it's just about as well controlled and logical at times. So these dynamics are happening again, and they're very clearly happening. They've been argued that what's happening in the Middle East, what happened to bring on the Arab Spring, was actually successive crop failures and drought, food shortages. There was also a real food supply problem from Russia, which supplies a lot of wheat due to fires and drought in that country. And so what happened was when people don't get enough to eat, they start a revolution. That also explains part of what happened in Syria when al-Assad refused to feed some of the population when they got into severe drought because they were the wrong political or religious group. Then that really triggered the fragmentation of Syria and the war there. And I think we're seeing this across the planet. We talk about climate refugees. The refugees that are coming from South America, coming from Africa and so forth, they're not all because of climate and hunger and all that type of thing. There are other factors at work. But I think that is a significant part of what's happening, and it's going to become an ever more significant part of what will happen. And if you look at the US election, Trump is running now on one issue, demonising immigrants. I mean, cats and dogs in Springfield, Ohio, are absolutely terrified. Also the geese, it seems. Now, actually, anyone who's been to an American town and seen the geese realises that most people there would be very happy if someone ate them, because they're Canada geese that are supposed to go to Canada, but they found it's much nicer to stay in the United States and crap all over the place. But if you've ever tried to eat a goose, that's fine. But if you've ever tried to catch one, I mean, honestly. So I think we're seeing this rise of this irrationality around immigration. We are not free of the immigration thing here. I mean, there's tremendous paranoia, tremendous political advantage for various people, used in, I think, often a particularly odious way. And I can't say our immigration policies are anything that any of us can be particularly proud of. But again, we're seeing far-right parties emerge in Germany. We actually saw a state taken over by a far-right party in Thuringia at a recent election. So migration is going to become an increasing issue, and that's going to be driven by climate change. So how are the Americans going to approach this? Well, Vice President Harris, President Biden introduced the Inflation Reduction Act, $370 billion to try and tackle climate change. It's a massive advance in what that country was doing. And also, Vice President Harris has said, as she runs for the election, that she's going to try and focus on correcting the underlying causes. Now, isn't that an interesting idea, that you'd actually look at underlying causes before you demonise people or you lock up 10-year-olds? But that would be revolutionary. President Trump has a different strategy. He will abolish the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. NOAA is the US Weather Service. It also does most of the work, a lot of the American work on climate change and climate science. And it's, in fact, a government agency. It's actually a commissioned corps of the US government. NOAA people, also the US Public Health Service, they can actually be required to wear a uniform. And they do it sometimes. The health service at one stage, when they get dressed up in the uniform, the guy you'd normally go to see in his lab, who'd be dressed in blue jeans and a scruffy T-shirt, you might go in there and he's dressed like an admiral. I mean, it's a very impressive uniform. Trump has also got another strategy for getting rid of the problem. He's going to drain this swamp of merit-based public officials. That means they're going to fire anyone who actually knows anything. Now, that is a wonderful strategy to move the country forward into oblivion and total second-rateness. He's going to replace them with MAGA types. So acknowledge or deny reality. So how will US voters see these two opposing strategies? I don't think they're even figuring on the election discussion. There's no real discussion. Harris wants to stay away from that discussion because there are so many polarised views. Trump is so set on demonising people and so forth that he's actually not pushing that at the moment. But really the basic strategy, we don't wish to know that, is not really a particularly useful strategy. We've also used it in this country with climate change. We've seen CSIRO scientists stood down. We've seen activities abolished in the CSIRO, particularly under the Howard government. Howard, interestingly, was one of the few prime ministers who knew anything about science and actually liked it. He used to go to the Prime Minister's science meetings, council science meetings, and sit in on them, and he was very interested. But I think climate change and climate science was just a bridge too far politically. And of course, that's the way it's proving to be in our society. So much for that. The general comments. So it's science communication and the professional scientists. I'd like to say something about my involvement with science communication, how I sort of came into this, and my experience of it. And I'll divide it into two bits, actually. I'll talk about how I got into it in the first place. I never intended to be a science communicator. I was very happy squirreling away in the lab, writing scientific papers, going to scientific meetings, being the most famous person in my field, or a famous person in your field. Being a famous person in a field of science is total irrelevancy, of course. I mean, if we would go to meetings. There were very nice meetings that were held in ski resorts for medical scientists. It was part of the US socialist model. US socialism works by giving money to business. Silicon Valley, all that activity was all funded initially by government grants to defence and to energy. Okay, so we think of the US as this great free enterprise country. Actually, a lot of the money comes from tax dollars. It goes directly to corporations, and so it is with science as well. I mean, if you spend money on science in America, it all comes back to America. You know, we spend money on science in Australia. We're buying American reagents or American equipment. You do it in America, it's all churning in America. And they had these meetings organised with the full complicity of the US government in ski resorts when they were a bit off-season so they could fill them up. All the scientists went up there. And for a while there was time to ski, but that soon disappeared. And I have no idea why I got into that. But, well, yeah, if you would come into one of those meetings early, often they were in an isolated ski hotel in Utah or in Colorado or somewhere, and you would come in and there would be the previous meeting would be there, and you could look down on the final cocktail party from the balcony up there, and you could sort of pick the people who are the famous people. Everyone's talking to them and sort of trying to be nice to them and so forth. And what was always interesting, I didn't have an idea who any of those people were. Being famous in science is about being as famous as an efficient pizza deliverer. After I won the Nobel Prize, I think I achieved a level of recognition in Australia, public recognition, that was about equivalent to a minor character in a coffee commercial that hadn't run for 3 months. And that's as it should be, I can tell you. Yeah, so as someone pointed out to me at the time when I first got into this stuff, no matter what you say or do, you will never be as much interest as the state of Plugger Lockett's groin. Now that will go right by the younger people, but I think Plugger Lockett's groin has been definitely in my mind for many years. So my involvement in this came when thunder struck, and I got a phone call at 4 o'clock in the morning in the US. Actually, my wife took it and then gave it to me, telling me I'd won a Nobel Prize. Now, that I didn't actually know all that much about the Nobel Prize, but it turns out to be a big deal. And so, you know, we had to go and meet the King of Sweden. Actually, the Kong is the right term, the Kong of Sweden, and get a medal from him and get a big cheque, which, of course, the Americans, the only country on earth that does it, I think, immediately took tax out of it. And so we won the Lasker Award the year before, which is one of these, it's the American kind of Nobel. With the Lasker Award, nobody takes much notice. I'd had to write stuff for them. They told us months ahead. With the Nobel, everyone takes notice because it's actually on the media landscape. That's why. It's the first of these prizes, very prestigious, and all the rest of it. So you suddenly become famous. And not only that, you know everything. I mean, which is really quite a revelation. But that wasn't the worst of it. We got, this is what we got. You watch that little green thing bump off this thing here. Now, isn't that good? That's a cancer cell, okay? Or any cell you like. And that's a killer T cell. And what we discovered is the nature of immunological surveillance. We discovered how it is that cells that go around the body, white blood cells called CD8 killer T cells, recognize cells in us that are damaged due to the fact they're infected with a virus. Viruses only grow in living cells, so you've got to get rid of the virus-producing factories. They're being used a lot against cancer because cancer cells have changed now. And these cells can go in anywhere and kill them off. So they're very effective. They're the assassins of immunity. So that's explaining exactly what I did, and now you understand it fully. The movie was made by Misty, who's actually a Curie scholar. She now has a lab at the Walter and Eliza Institute, and she's doing great. So, but the thing that was bad enough. When you win the Nobel Prize, suddenly you become everybody's property. They all want you to give a talk in the next year. before another one comes along. So you get all these invitations. You're busy anyway. I mean, any senior scientist is kind of busy with meetings and grant reviews and writing grants and getting papers out and all the rest of it. But then this comes on top, the Nobel Prize comes on top. The institute I was at, St Jude Children's Research Hospital, very wealthy. I won't go into it, but this is an institution that treats kids with cancer free. It brings them down to Memphis, it puts up their families, looks after them, flies them back and forth, monitors them for decades afterwards. It raises $1 billion a year in public donation. It also gets insurance back from the medical insurers. It also has a lot of government grant money and all the rest of it. But it's a fantastic institution. It comes out of Hollywood, basically. And while I was there, I got to know some people like Robin Williams and a few people like that. I actually met Jennifer Aniston. I had no idea who she was, but she seemed a nice young woman. But the thing that really got me was that on Christmas, these things are announced in October, and you go to Sweden and Stockholm and you pick up the Nobel Prize. There's a whole week of parties and big dinners and white tie and tails and Swedish drinking songs and all that sort of stuff. And that's very nice, and you get your own limo. In our case, in that time, it was a stretch Volvo. You've seen a lot of those. And Lindsay Fox was there. Why was Lindsay there? Buys a lot of Volvo trucks. It's like the Queen of England. They use it for marketing. It's about marketing. The Royal Yacht Britannia was a marketing exercise. So anyway, so about Christmas Eve, I get a call from Australia. Someone, I thought maybe slightly bit tipsy, telling me I'd been made the Australian of the Year. And so I said, well, what's that? And can I put it off for another year? And they said, no, you can't if you ever want to visit Australia again. I said, well, then I better do it. And so we came out from Memphis. Here I am. Different rules then. Now it's a kind of Miss America contest compared by the Prime Minister. Then it was a group of people sitting together in Sydney with a couple of bottles of Grange. They had to pick someone, then they could get on with drinking. And so if you won a Nobel Prize, you were it. So it didn't matter whether you're in Tennessee or England or anything else. And so I was the Australian of the Year. So we came out a number of times. That's what put me on the public stage. I got here and congratulated John Howard on the progress they were making with becoming a republic. And I became a cartoon character. That was interesting. And because I was kind of, living in America, which really you shouldn't be doing if you're Australian of the Year, I think. And there were all sorts of cartoons and remarks and all sorts of stuff. And I talked a lot. And I was on the public stage, and I was fine. I was talking in town halls and all sorts of big meetings. And I'm talking to the general population, ordinary people and sane people. And basically, that's a whole different game. So I learnt science communication on the job. There's various things that you do learn. I thought of it as the Rex effect. High above the hushed crowd, Rex tried to remain focused, but he knew he was an old dog and he was trying to learn a new trick. Now I'm a very old dog and there are no new tricks left, but still. And I vaccinated, I was shown, one cartoon showed me vaccinating John Howard against the idea of an Australian Republic. He didn't actually need that, and he was a confirmed monarchist. The whole thing now seems... will we ever become a republic? Maybe, I suppose. So first question to read science communication for the working scientist. Is it a good use of your time? And I've spent a lot of time doing it over the last few years. I'm actually not sure it is, but what I am sure of is that old scientists have to get out of the way. You need to retire, you need to quit, you need to open the thing up for younger scientists. Newton said it way back. Science advances by funerals. And so it's better to kill yourself off. So if you're going to become a science communicator, you better get a reasonable idea of what it is you're trying to communicate. Are you the right person to do that? I can tell you, some scientists should never speak in public, ever, at all, under any circumstance. It's like running science programs on string theory. If you want to turn the population off, have a science program on string theory. Who exactly you're trying to communicate with, and what is the best mechanism for communication. We make lots of mistakes. Scientists and teachers, we tend to instruct and tell. You should never do that. You've got to show. you've got to involve, you've got to get people along with you. They use words and phrases that seem normal to them. And I don't mean scientific jargon. I mean, CTL MHC Class 1 probably doesn't mean a whole lot to most of you, but they use words that they think are normal. When did you last say cognate or abrogate or probabilistic or controlled? I mean, you know, people don't use these words, and they use them all the time. And of course, they use a PowerPoint presentation, and they will frequently talk to the PowerPoint and not look at the audience. We've all experienced that, I suppose. So, scientific thinking is all dominated by ideas that are based in experiments that look at sample size, probability, relative risk, and so forth. So we think about numbers and controls and all that sort of thing. Public perceptions are often dominated by N=1 encounters, basically gossip, that meeting someone in the supermarket queue, personal situations and emotion. The broader public doesn't care whether you published in Nature, the top scientific journal, or the Batuta Advocate. Actually, it would be more interesting if it was published in the Advocate. Or if you're a National Academy member, what the hell does that mean? The thing you've got to learn, one thing you've got to learn very quickly, you do learn very quickly, is never, intentionally or not, humiliate a questioner. I mean, no matter if the questioner stands up and they say something that most of your audience think is really not all that bright, if you humiliate that person in some way, you'll lose your audience. I mean, you have to treat people with respect. Communication is about trying to engage respectfully, especially with people who don't agree with you. Respect is basic. And of course, what we're seeing, for instance, the American election is an absence of that. In any area of communication, your job is to intrigue, maybe entertain a little, perhaps if you're lucky, inform and change perceptions. You've got to try not to be boring. I mean, you need to be prepared, you need to know your audience if possible, and if it's an interview format, maybe you know a bit about your interrogator. But what I learned very quickly on that public stage, talking to radio, talking to press and all the rest of it, is that the only really safe form of public communication at that time, when we were dealing with the conventional media, was something you write yourself without editing for a newspaper or whatever format, or direct-to-air TV or radio. Once things are edited, it's out of your control. And the newspapers of the day, it wasn't necessarily the fault of the journalist. If they were reporting or taking something you'd written and working on it, it could often be the fault of the sub-editor. And I've had that from Murdoch journalists, for instance, where they'd say, we wrote a perfectly nice article on something or other. It went to our editor. We know them well. They treat us well, and it was a good piece in our paper. Then it's picked up in the Herald Sun or somewhere. The Herald Sun had a very good medical writer. Then it's picked up, say, in the Brisbane Courier Mail. So the Brisbane Courier Mail guy, they cut half the article, the sub-editor cuts some more, and it becomes total, absolute crap. And we've all had this experience. If you have something that you know about reported on, say, the ABC News, you listen to it and you say, well, what the fuck was that about? And if you feel you've been represented by a journalist, don't fight with them. You're not going to win. Just let it go. The most important thing is never get in the fight, because the fight becomes the story. And we see that happen over and over again in politics. I mean, it's the fight that becomes the story, not the actual controversy or disagreement. And you shouldn't think of any media format as being beneath you, because what you're trying to do is communicate with people that you don't normally communicate with. And so if you can go on drive radio, that's great. If you can go on heavy metal radio, that turned to be very interesting. I wasn't even sure what heavy metal was, but and it's actually a lot of fun. And if you get it in the right sort of frame, you can go backwards and forwards very nicely. I don't know if community newspapers are still a thing. They were when I was doing this. And often then in the community newspaper, firstly, it was a throwaway, so everybody got it. And secondly, a lot of the journalists were young. They were much more flexible, much more interesting, and quite frankly, I mean, if you look at some of our older journalists, they're morons. I mean, honestly, some of the Greg Sheridan. Oh, good God. Now, yeah, well, I don't want a Sheridan worm in my brain as well. So one of the things that I'm sort of proud of is when Andrew Jaspin, who'd been an editor of The Age, and he'd been an editor of The Scotsman before that. We lived in Edinburgh for 5 years, so I knew The Scotsman very well. It was a very good source of religious information, and we relied on it for that. And but it's quite a good newspaper, and so he became disillusioned with the Age. Andrew tends to move on fairly, but he got this idea of the conversation. And if any of you have written for it, some of you young guys, I hope you would write for it. It takes an 800-word article from an academic or someone in a research institute or whatever, and then they put that article through a professional newsroom so that it's edited by journalists and professional editors, and they go back and forth in a very nice online media exchange, and you get a truly good little article out of it. And then it's freely available to everyone. They do ask for donations if you're inclined to do so. Freely available. You just have to put the conversation AU or something in your Google and put your name in and give your email address. They'll deliver content every day every 6 days a week to your website. And many of the articles you read in the conventional press that make some sense are actually conversation articles. The deal is they don't change them, but they're free to pick them up and use them anytime they want, anywhere they want. And it's gone global, so it's now in many countries. It's in at least, it's in several languages, and there is also a global conversation. So that I think is a model for what can be done in the information space. And maybe we should think more about broadening that kind of model. But the problem is to fund it. The problem is with anything online is how do you fund it and how do you support it? And that's, I think, one of the issues that has to be solved. Then the other communication blitz that I was involved in, of course, around COVID-19. My area of research is in infection and immunity, and that's what our institute does. It's an infection and immunity institute. It's a very unusual institute. It actually has the academic microbiology and immunology department of the University of Melbourne. It's a very good teaching department and research department, and we have a lot of, NHMRC research fellows and all that sort of stuff. But what it also did is it brought into that same building the state diagnostic labs. That's the virus diagnostic lab, Vidral, the virus that looks at, someone gets a virus infection, you have to identify the virus, see what's wrong, and then give them some sort of answer back to the doctor. And the microbiology diagnostic unit, bacterial disease, same thing. It also houses the clinical doctors from Royal Melbourne Hospital who have their patients across the street, but actually have offices in our building. And it has one of the 6 World Health Organization influenza centres. We call it WHO-Flu. So it's actually a mixture of academic and community healthcare, in a sense. But it's a lab. We're not a public health institute. We didn't lock anybody down or tell them they had to go vaccine. That wasn't our job. We're a public health laboratory as well as an academic research environment. And when COVID actually hit, what happened was that we were having a meeting, and I've never seen this done. I worked in many research institutes and research universities. But what we did quickly instituted a morning meeting, 8:30 to 9:15, where on Zoom, initially people got together, then it was quickly on Zoom. But what happened there was all the group heads from the diagnostic side, the research side, and so forth, and the epidemiologists all came together and just said what it is they're doing and what's bothering them, where they're going. And it was just fantastic because for me, and the job I took on in this was to become the junior untrained journalist for our science communications team. So that's what I did. I did science communication. I've been doing it since 1996, but this put me into a whole new environment where, of course, everything pretty much was online, Zoom, and, of course, because of the Nobel Prize cachet, I was sort of doing this stuff across the planet. And I found myself actually working incredibly hard. But it was an enormously good way to get that information together. Since COVID's gone away, we dropped it back to once a month. We were doing it 3 times a week during the peak of the thing. Dropped it back to once a month. We're now having it once a week because of monkeypox, which is a problem, but it's a limited problem. It's not going to cause some horrible pandemic. This proved extraordinarily successful very quickly. We got an enormous amount of funding. We got funding from philanthropists. We got funding from China. I was talking about vaccines. I was trying to tell people how, on the media, I was trying to tell them how they work and what their strengths and weaknesses are and all the rest of it, and about the disease itself. My interest is in how diseases work. How does a virus cause death? What is it doing? What do we need to counter in that basic mechanism of disease and so forth? So I was talking about the disease and I was talking about that. I tried very much not to talk about public health because we are the lab for the Victorian Public Health Department, and they may go in ways that we don't necessarily think are all that smart, and we didn't want to get across them in any sense. Because the last thing you need in a pandemic is mixed messages. And actually, the first conversation I'd had with Greg Hunt, who was then Health Minister, he basically called me up and he said, "Are you going to support us in this?" And I said, "Yeah, of course. We've got to have a unified public health response. Otherwise, people just get confused and it's a disaster." And that hung together for about a year, I think, the unified response. And then things started to fragment in all sorts of directions. We have a communications group. They're very good. They arranged all the interviews and stuff, got me writing stuff, and got various other people writing stuff. And that of course, you need professionals. And it was really quite an experience. I spoke to the whole media format in Australia, ABC to Sky News to heavy metal and all that sort of stuff. Everyone engaged pretty decently and respectfully from my point of view. And I didn't have hostile engagements. I was just trying to explain what the disease was, what it's about, what our understanding of it was. And our understanding changed dramatically through the course of the thing. We did not understand this disease at all when it hit. And we understand it a bit better now, but there are still enormous questions. So it was a very, very interesting experience, and it really put our institute on the map, as you probably know. We've just had our 10th anniversary, and it really, we need a good pandemic to get that going. But I'd always joke with the influenza people. They always hark back. I was in influenza research off and on for 50 years, I guess. They always hark back to the 1918-19 pandemic when 50 million people died. And they always say, "Oh, this could happen again, this could happen." Of course, it could happen again, though I'm not sure. I think we're a lot better at dealing with influenza than we were for various reasons. A lot of people died from secondary bacterial infection. We have antibiotics. That wouldn't happen and so forth. But it was always a bit of a thought in my mind, these guys would really like a nice pandemic, wouldn't they? So, and I think some other people think there might have been a conspiracy, but that wasn't the case. But I learned a lot because you know how it is, we all know this, things in our kind of broad area, we know superficially about them, but it's only when you work in something and you get into it, you really get an understanding of how it works. So it was fascinating. I greatly enjoyed it. And I actually wrote a book called An Insider's Plague Year that came out of that. I wouldn't buy it, but it's... yeah. And also the other thing we had is that, Australia is a great place, but, if you're a scientist here and you're on international committees, you're meeting at 3 in the morning, 11 at night, 2 in the morning or something. And we'd have these guys, they'd come on and they want to talk about what the latest was, bleary-eyed and exhausted and so forth. And it was quite a time. So I actually wrote a blog through the pandemic, 800 to 1,000 word articles every week for 120 weeks. Gives me enormous admiration for people like Philip Adams who do this for a living. It's really a pretty tough thing to do. And I did publish this book. I found being a blogger actually pretty hard work. And if you're going to be a blogger and a serious blogger, and I think we need them, then you've got to put work into it again. And how do you fund it? And that, I think, is a question that we need to answer. Social media. Well, my own experience on social media with Twitter. Twitter was fantastic through the COVID-19 pandemic because it was reasonably well modulated. We had highly intelligent people coming on it, and we had professionals coming on it. Say an obstetrician who got very interested in what's happening in pregnant women with COVID, with the vaccines and so forth. We'd put up a thread of references, comments and so forth, which was incredibly informative. Because as far as I was concerned, anything I said from the medical side about COVID, I had to follow my medical colleagues. Nobody wants to be treated by a vet. And we certainly shouldn't, well, you know, certainly not in epidemiological terms. I mean, our disease elimination strategy is test and slaughter. So you can't do that. I gained enormously in Twitter followers. I had Twitter open, I had Google open, and I had my internet and my email open. And I mistakenly put into Twitter, what are Dan Murphy's opening hours? This may be incredibly popular. It's my most famous contribution to communication ever. It will never be forgotten because it showed them I have this pompous prof title in my Twitter handle, which I shouldn't have had. It showed them I'm just as big an idiot as anybody else. My wife knows that, of course, but not everyone did. So I ended up with 118 Twitter followers. Then, of course, Musk came in, destroyed it, turned it into X. But there are still people on it who are good, but a lot of the good people have left. And I'm, at the moment, very quiet. I don't know quite what to do with it. I'm hoping someone will buy it and change it back. And there are some rumours now that someone actually may buy it, because it was great. And I think Musk bought it specifically to stop that open exchange between intelligent people. I think he wanted to destroy it, and he has done enormous damage. So, social media? Well, social media is great, but I'm not sure I can handle it. It's an incredible time sink. And of course, latterly with Twitter, X that is, you have to maintain the primary rule of turkey avoidance. Basically, never fight with turkeys. They have incredibly small brains, are very fierce, very strong, and they never give up. So it's pointless. So whether it's a bot or not, don't fight with them. The other thing I think we need that's great as a movement in science and movement in the public is citizen science. And I think everything we can do, I think to some extent you do that through schools involving kids in experiments and all the rest of them. We've got that little molecular centre near University High that does that. But the more we can involve people in actually doing something so that this is not a remote activity, it's part of their activity. Citizen science is great. Get into it through BirdLife Australia, the bird counts and so forth. If you're interested in birds at all, you don't have to be a twitcher and ride around on motorcycles and get frozen. You can actually do it. There are things like Water Watch that monitors the rivers. You can go on citizen science vacations where you pay to be a slave doing something or other with tortoises or whatever. I think these are great fun, and it's terrific. So involvement and ownership. I think that's what we need. The more we can get into the community, the idea you own this. This is your world. The better off we'll do in actually getting action. And of course, in the end analysis, in the sort of society we live in, it's action from politicians. And as we know, the pressures they're under and all the rest of it, we won't go into that, that's too difficult. But, and I still think the leopard, it said very clearly, if we want things to stay as they are, things will have to change. And that's absolutely true. Things can't stay as they are by operating in the way we are now. We have to give up on some things that are of considerable importance to us, and we have to think of other things that are equally or more important to us that are actually life-sustaining and enhancing. And that is what has to happen if we are to have a decent future. I have great confidence and hopes for the young among us because, you know, a lot of the people of my age and a bit younger have, through this, behaved like absolute idiots, and they're not going to change. So, anyway, that's it. I'm finished. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. What a brilliant lecture. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. A really fantastic start to the lecture
The
series.
bandage on my head, I'm not copying Trump, but when I was walking the dog yesterday, a tree branch tried to assassinate me.
That's trees for you. For me, I got two really important points from what you said there, which was both really excellent but also really engaging, as everyone will agree. The first is the importance of education in cultivating an informed skepticism in society. And that question, what's the problem and what's the nature of the evidence, I think really came through strongly for me. That science, that education isn't dogma, it's not a doctrinal indoctrination. And I think that for me was a really important point. The second one came towards the end too, when you talked about, which I think links very keenly to the theme of the series, and Peter Fensham's commitment to scientific inquiry for all. The fact that it's someone everybody should be involved in. And it's a way of engaging with and coming to understand the world around us. So thank you so much for that.
Well, it's important not to call it science, because science, particularly for people who are often quite well educated in the liberal arts, is an absolute turn-off. As soon as they get to anything sciencey, turn off. So we have to take it beyond that. To mic on.
Mic is on. You're on, I think.
On?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on.
Mic is on.
Yeah, so anyway, but I think that's up to educators and people who think a lot about this stuff. And I think we have to think so much. I mean, really, science education when I was a kid, it was, well, it was very academically oriented. It was streamed, and it was towards the kids who were going on with science, either to go to university, or at that time to become science teachers, particularly. When I was the high school I went to in Brisbane was just a brand new high school. Queensland was pretty behind educationally, actually, in various ways. And boys couldn't learn biology at all, which actually I think might have been a good thing, because one of the very interesting experiments, and educators may have an opinion about that, is physics first. You know this movement that started in the United States? I think the problem with biology, it's very interesting for little kids, and they have a lot of fun and all the rest of it. But then as it goes on, I think at times it starts to get boring, because it's about detail and all that sort of stuff. The movement in the US that really turned on black kids in central Chicago, actually, was what's called physics first. What is you approach science? Firstly, you teach an intensive course to year 9. You teach an intensive course in physics. Then you teach an intensive course in chemistry. And then you teach biology. And so you're coming at it from an intellectual, conceptual viewpoint. And you might think that would be restricted to, say, the higher intellect. It actually worked really well across the spectrum. So I don't know where that's going. It's very difficult to do. Firstly, the main thing is really hard to find physics teachers.
It is. We do have time for questions. I'm going to keep an eye on the clock here. Probably not questions from biologists first.
No, you can attack me on that.
We've got questions too from YouTube.
I didn't learn any biology till I went to university, and then it was wonderful.
So if you're on YouTube and you'd like to ask a question, you can post it in the chat, and then one of my colleagues in the room will read the question out. And we have a roving mic, I think, in the room too. So who would like to start us off with a question? The first hand I saw was here. Yeah, it was you, the person looking behind them.
You just talked a little bit about it, but near the start of your talk, you were talking about instilling a sort of scientifically minded attitude in the broader population. And I guess one of the things, I'm sure everyone has experienced this who's studied something in detail, but I'm doing my honours in maths, and the more I learn about maths, the more disappointed I am by the way that like high school maths is taught and primary school maths is taught. So I wanted to ask, what particular things do you think should change about the way we do education? Do you have views about like standardized testing or the way
honestly, that's a question for educators.
For educators, okay.
Yeah,
and that
was... I kind of, to some extent, I got turned off math at school. I mean, I think the math teacher was sincere and so forth, but I don't think it didn't get me. Math gets some people, and it doesn't get others, actually. I mean, I work with, well, now, I didn't at the beginning of my career when science was very different, but we work with mathematicians, statisticians all the time. But the data sets we generate are so massive, we can't handle it any other way. So we're all working with biometricians and all the rest of it. And it's great. I really enjoy it. But I'm very happy to take them at their word. But I think these are the things we need to think about a lot. There is a basic question in my mind, and I almost hesitate to ask us, but are we divided to some extent into the curious and the incurious? I mean, you need curiosity, and I guess most of us in the room are probably high on the curiosity stakes, but is there an incurious phenotype? Honestly, because I don't know, because actually when I was a kid, a lot of my parents' generation particularly were educated to age 15. And you could have really good and smart discussions. They were very sceptical. I only know it recently, and reading an essay about one of David Malouf's, who's a fellow Brisbane boy. And David said, and he was a school teacher in Queensland, he said this Queensland education system in the 1950s assumed that 90% of kids would leave school by age 15. 90%, or was it 95%? Very few. They tended to go on to private high schools, and a very small percentage went to university. And he said, so the Queensland curriculum was designed to get as much as possible. And it was actually very broad and so forth. Now, of course, it did teach the British Empire was the greatest thing that ever happened, and now we have the odd reservation. But I think it did that, actually. And actually, my parents' generation wrote a good letter, spoke well, smart. They left school at 15. We have graduate students who can't write, who are educated all the way through, sometimes through very expensive schools. So they can't write.
We've got two questions coming up. One person here, and then the third person here. So I can't remember who it was. Yes, thank you. Oh, sorry. The second person I think was here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Someone's on that side. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm waiting for
Peter, you spoke about the fact that you were involved in a lot of international forums during COVID-19. I just wondered, during those forums, whether you found that everyone was spilling all the beans about what they knew, and it was truly a sort of, you could get access to the cutting-edge sort of science, or were some people keeping their cards close to their chest due to the fact that vaccines might be on the horizon?
Yeah, once you get into sort of production of things and so forth, you can run into commercial incompetence and all that sort of stuff. But if you're talking about the science community I live in, and which is the basic science community, very open discussion. Of course, if someone's made a big breakthrough and they know someone else could repeat it very quickly, they might try and hold that back until it's published. Physics has a way around that, actually. What physics does is, or basic physics, they circulate the research paper to everyone beforehand, so everyone knows where it is, and then they don't publish it till there's a lot of discussion and input coming back. So the first communication in physics may often be in the proceedings of a scientific meeting, whereas in biomedical sciences it's in the scientific literature. But actually it was incredibly open. Everyone was looking for solutions. We just wanted solutions. And so everyone's sharing information, and mostly in my field it's pretty much like that. Particularly in virology, maybe sometimes a bit less slow in immunology. There are more medical doctors and they can get a bit up themselves at times.
We've got another question here, and I think maybe one more question online.
Yeah, g'day Peter, and how you going there? Yeah. Wade Northhouse is my name. I run an organisation called Billboard Battalion, as you can tell. Come from northern Victoria, but we travel all over Australia speaking to many issues. Some of them are COVID, some of them are farmers. Right. Some are climate change. There's so much I'd love to say here, and I'd put it to Viv that give us a bit of a shot to have a couple of hours speaking up here, Viv, at Monash, and we might present the other side of the story, because I might be considered...
Give the next lecture.
Sorry?
Give the next lecture.
Yeah, I'll be here in another hour or so. We'll be right, mate.
Well, I won't be.
However, and I'm serious about that. You know, if you wanted to have give somebody else an opportunity who's not an academic, somebody who went to in these days Year 9, the old Form 3, you know, farmer, third generation farmer from Northern Victoria.
Right.
So, you know, you spoke about talking to people with honour and dignity and not
Yes.
belittling people.
Yes, absolutely.
So I would put it to you that you made many references to conspiracy theories or conspiracy theorists. And, you know, a lot of the people that I listen to and talk to are medical doctors.
Right.
I deal a lot with the doctors in AMPS, and we, you know, see a lot from international experts in the field who talk about COVID. And I just wanted to say that the inference of using the term conspiracy theorist in the first instance...
Did I talk about conspiracy theories?
Absolutely.
Really?
So...
Look, I mean, we're all subject to it. Conspiracy theories. I have conspiracy theories. My theory is that Rupert Murdoch was recruited by Joe Stalin to destroy Western civilization. Now, there is absolutely no evidence for that. Absolutely no evidence. But you can build a conspiracy around it. There are a lot of things you can build conspiracy theories around. So basically, what a scientist like me has to do is to go back and try to look at the evidence. So there's a lot I don't know. There's a lot we don't know about this virus. There's a lot that's still coming out. And what we've got to do, and my next endeavour, I've been taking a year off. I've just retired at age 82. And basically, I've been doing a lot of personal business stuff. But what I need to do now is go back and look at that COVID literature and try and work out what's happening with some of these things. And I'm not talking about it at the moment because I don't understand some of this properly. I'm not across the evidence. But what we have to do is go to the evidence as far as we can.
Absolutely.
And the evidence, and basically, for some of the evidence, you have to be a scientist to actually read it, to understand it. So there have been, I think, characters who've come on the scene in this who've gone in some pretty unfortunate directions, and we may not agree on how those characters are, but all I can do is try and work from the evidence and work from colleagues, insights of colleagues that I know are straight and know respect. There's not a lot of deception out there in the scientific community. That's not what we're about. But the reputation in science depends basically on getting it right. That's
Okay.
what science is
Thank you
about.
very much. I'll go to the final question, the questioner is online. So would you like to read out the question?
Yes, this is from Maria, and she'd like to ask you, Peter, if you find science communication challenging, and what are your thoughts about scientists sharing their work through social media?
I think as far as possible, we should try and get information out there. I mean, a lot of the science itself is now open access, but it's pretty hard for someone who's not trained in science to read a lot of it. You need some background in it. I think we should try and tell the story as we understand it as clearly as we can. But with a lot of these things, a lot in biology is still a bit messy, actually, and it is messy. I mean, a lot in climate science is, a lot of these climate systems that they're seeing, they predict general effects, like we're going to get these enormous downpours of rain, but we get less rain and all the rest of it. But actually predicting details and so forth has been much more difficult. So, we do research because we don't know everything. I mean, scientists are not priests. We don't tell you this is what it is because that's not the way it is. Anything, I'm a Nobel Prize winner. I've got some things wrong, and it could happen sometime that some kid will come along doing experiments in a lab, and he'll say, not only is this guy wrong, he is full of shit all along. That's science. I mean, it really is. And so it's a process as much as anything else. But, to engage with a field of science in depth, you need to know that field of science. And I can comment on other areas of science, but I'm always pretty careful because, I don't know those areas in depth, particularly clinical stuff. I'm not a medical doctor, and I have enormous respect for them, and they know much more physiology. They know about how systems interact and all the rest of endocrinologists and people like this. And I don't know that stuff. So, I've got to try and talk with them if I'm going to try and write about it, which I will try and write about. Yeah. So but it's a big tent, and skepticism, fine. But you put your point of view. It's what you should do. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everybody, for attending this evening. You've set the bar very high for the Peter Fensham Lecture Series, very high indeed. Thank you to Peter, but also thank you to the Fensham family, who've made this evening really special. It was very important for us that you were here, so I thank you a lot. But I also like to thank a few other people. As Rachel mentioned, Emeritus Professor Dick Gunston, who's here, has been absolutely instrumental in putting this lecture together. So I'd like to thank and acknowledge Dick. Where are you, Dick? I'd also like to thank Lisa Mitchell from University Advancement and her colleague Heather Little, who is currently renewing her wedding vows in India. Who can't be with us this evening. But Lisa has done a fantastic job in managing this wonderful new Peter and Christine Fensham Regional Research Fund, and we're very grateful to you, Lisa. Also to all of the people you can see around the edge here who are part of the faculty's academic and professional staff, particularly the event team and studio